Well, good morning, fam. It's Freedom Friday, and you are still not free. We are back with El Mekki, Brother El Mekki, and me, Chris Stewart. Today, we want to talk about what should we teach our kids about slavery. The context of us even wanting to have this conversation is the fact that every year we see a spat or a spate or a trend, I don't know what you would call it, of stories that pop up in social media that where parents are sharing inappropriate assignments that their kids have received at school. So here's an example of one. Some parents are outraged over fifth graders' slave auction poster. So you go to school, you send your kid to school, they have an actual slave auction in the square where students are actually asked to play the role of slaves. Imagine your kid. Would that be a lot of fun? Here's another one in New York, involved almost the same thing, where Black students at a school were made very uncomfortable because they were asked to play the Black roles in a slavery assignment. And you're a kid, you're in a classroom, you can't say no to these things. You're young, your understanding of the world isn't super sophisticated, but you feel a little uneasy about this because it makes you feel like the other in the classroom. So you're being given an assignment that literally makes you aware instantly. Oh, not only am I different than these other people around me, but I'm different in that I have a shameful part of my history that they don't have. At least that's what you're thinking in your young mind. And that's possibly because of the way that you're being taught. Here's one. South Carolina parents outraged over the choose to be a slave owner or slave e-learning assignment. And you see the parent wrote here, right on here, big red letters, "My child will not complete this assignment." I'm surprised that there isn't like a cuss word in there. So hats off to this parent for the "my child will not be," but
for the restraint.
Yeah, the restraint, but 1, 2, 3, 4 exclamation points. Like, let's drive this home. Let's make this real for you. Wisconsin apologizes for this assignment that kids got that asked them to think of a few good reasons for slavery, right? Think of 3. So again, you are a child, a student in the classroom. You're being given this. You're in probably an integrated environment, and you look around and your reaction to this work is different than the person maybe who's sitting next to you who has a different history than yours. Their reaction, for them, it's abstract. It's a lesson. For you, it's part of your formation of self, your identity, your thinking about where do I fit in the world and where do I fit in this world, like this context that I'm in right now. I wanted to talk about this today because actually, one more story for people who have watched this show. You've heard me say this before. In Minnesota, we had we figured out that there was this program called Flight to Freedom, and I want to show you guys this real quick, and then you let me know what you think. All right, you ready, El Mekki?
No,
Okay.
But go ahead anyway.
I'm just gonna show you. Okay, so anybody watching, and you, El Mekki, I'm a parent. You're an educator. This is a curriculum that is provided for students, and this is just a trailer. It's only 30 seconds. It's a trailer for the curriculum.
The year is 1848. You are Lucy King, a 14-year-old enslaved on a Kentucky plantation. You want to escape, but how will you do it?
We all help in different ways.
And who can you trust?
I'll have my eye on you.
Can you find a path to freedom?
Come in quickly, or you're followed.
Play Mission US online, an interactive way to learn history.
All right. So in this game, Flight to Freedom, you are Lucy, and Lucy has to get her flight to freedom by interacting with the mistress, the master, and other various white people. And the way that you win coins to earn your freedom is you have to make a decision whether you're going to say the right thing or the wrong thing. And the right thing is a thing that is very deferential, very kind of, like whatever with the white folks so that you can make your freedom. 13-year-old black girl brought this to her parents' attention that she was being asked to play this game as part of their social studies curriculum. She was one of the few black kids in the room, and she was very uncomfortable being Lucy, trying to do her flight to freedom. So basically, let's just say you have gamified and virtualized slavery. And you're at like putting kids into virtual slavery so that they can encounter it or experience it in some way, shape, or form. Anyways, I could see this, by the way, is made by PBS. It was in schools all across the country. We fought to get it out of the schools in Minneapolis after that student brought it up. But this is a great place to start. Like, how should we contextualize slavery as a lesson for students? Even some basic questions, Sharif, like, why should we even teach it? And does it even matter anymore? And is it more hurtful than helpful in terms of Black child development? You know, to help me put it in a context from a lesson perspective, what should we be teaching? If all these folks are going to get it wrong, what's the right thing that we should be doing?
Yeah, no, I think the right thing, one, I can just share, like, I don't start my children's, their learning about history in this, on this continent with enslavement. And I think I'm sure, I'm absolutely positive, and there's a lot of evidence around this where that's where a lot of educators start, even talking about historic impact and experience of Black people in this country. I start with freedom. Like, I literally start with teaching about what does freedom mean to me. And I'm so glad this came up. I was literally just having this conversation with my 4.5 and 6 year, well, should be 5 next month, right? So 5 and 6 year old about this and what does it mean? Because it was in the context of what's Monday, Labor Day. And, you know, the teacher was talking about, yes, and white, you know, they didn't say white people. They're like, the laborers were not paid well. And so I sat them down. I was like, so remember all this stuff? You know, I've been talking about freedom for a long time. Like, what does it mean to be free? What does it mean to be fair? What does it mean to resist? And in this moment. And so I was like, remember we talked about like freedom, and how about some people weren't paid at all? If they were Black, they weren't paid at all. And my daughter's like, that's not fair. What is that? What do you mean? And so then we start getting into this conversation of people exerting force and cruelty and taking away freedoms and not paying as well. So I wanted her to have that while we were talking about Labor Day and the workers in the early 1900s and what that meant. Like, yeah, all right, let's understand that. Let's understand the role of you know, barons and industrialists and all that kind of stuff. But let's talk about, you know, while they're doing that, what they're doing to others and what their grandfathers did to others. So I do think it's important, because if you don't face that past, you can't confront the realities of today. You can't talk about why are we saying Black Lives Matter in 2020 without talking about the history of enslavement of first the indigenous people and then kidnapping other people to make you to fulfill your greed, which is never, we know in all scriptures, greed can never be fulfilled. So I think it's important to teach it, but how we do it and the mindset is the critical juncture.
I like what you said about starting with freedom and not starting with slavery. I think about my kids. And from my oldest to my youngest, I didn't really explicitly sit down and say, we're going to learn about slavery or let's talk about your enslavement or the past of slavery or whatnot. To be very honest with you, I mean, for right or for wrong, this is just me talking as a parent. For right or for wrong, I was a little bit mono obsessed with what would prepare them for the world that they were about to get. Like, you know, what would help them be successful in the world in ways that I wasn't successful, like in ways that, like, so I was always thinking future.
Which is dire enough, you know, sobering enough, right?
Yeah, it was like, and you know, it felt a little bit more urgent for them to learn some practical things so that they didn't get caught up in the filter early, like in their 20s, in their teens, and you know, I shouldn't say they, you know, I still have younger kids, but you know, my thinking is always like, you're going to be next year, you're going to be this age. And in 5 years, you're going to be this age. And, you know, where do I want you to be? What do I need you to learn and whatever? So we never really sat down and talked about slavery. Do you feel like the argument around if you don't know your past, you don't know where you're going is applicable to the parent who is thinking, I know where you're going and it's not good. I just urgently need to make sure you get the skills that you need to navigate this world, not the past.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's hard to separate the two. What I would say is it's like a lot of other things. I would prefer to be the first. They're going to hear about it. They're going to be confronted with it. I'd rather manage that as much as possible. You know, my mom used to say, you know, and I shared this on A Black Hands. She was like, well, if anybody go and brainwash you, it's going to be me. I'm not going to allow, I'm not going to allow outside folks, you know, some of them who may be like, you know, diametrically opposed to my belief and my values to broach the conversation and have that discussion without me observing and being a part of it and informing it and giving you some of the background. So I think that piece is where I would want to make sure that they weren't hearing about it first in their third grade teacher classroom during February, and they just flippantly talking about, you know, oh, this happened, or they're in first grade and they're reading about the book that came out through Scholastics where the slaves baked George Washington a cake, and they were so happy and thrilled to give him a cake, and then they took the bowl of the mix in the kitchen and licked it clean. Like, this is that in the actual book. So I'd rather have the conversation where they can, you know, kids have to also be taught how to resist nonsense, not only for the future and what they're saying, but also stuff that they may see, read, and hear. Even if they don't confront the adult that's saying that, at least bringing it up, because so many kids are disrespected or experience racism, and they don't say anything to their families, right? Because they're nervous about it. So I want that kind of conversation. So, but yeah, I get like how you were thinking about like, all right, future, what needs to be told, I think about this. I got a 20-year-old. He's like, sometimes he just likes to ride around. Like, it's Sunday afternoon back in the day. It just wants to, and I'm just like, hey, all right, well, you understand this and you understand like, the traps that they play and how it can all play out. And I want him to also know, like, it's rooted. It's not something that's new. I don't want them to just think like, oh, it's because of this current election or the past election. No, this is in the very fibers of this country. So.
It feels like when people talk about slavery, though, in Black history, you have said that you think that slavery was an interruption of Black history. It's not Black history. But in the United States, it feels like the impression that a lot of education people will give when they talk about slavery is it's the primary story to be told about Black folks, which to me seems like educational abuse of a Black child. Done by people who don't know any better. I don't know why they don't know any better. They're in education and they run the education establishment. But I mean, I wonder about it. Like, you have Afrocentric homes that spend 90% of the lessons that they teach their kids about kings and queens and about accomplishments and achievements and about contributions to civilization and to humanity and to the world. And then you drop down into the American public school and you learn about slavery, right? Like, as the primary story that you're being told about yourself, except for that 28 days of February where you get to write a book report on Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, and Malcolm X, maybe, and Martin Luther King every year for 28 days. You get a little bit of that. But for the rest of the time, dealing with you and your contributions, it's really about slavery. And that to me is offensive.
Yeah. And I think, and this is where I think is important, and you notice I went to elementary school. It was very pro-Black, very protective of our psyche, of our intellect, of our, of the powers that we were blessed with as human beings. And I don't think and we talked about enslavement a lot, but I think what was grounding in it was one, talking about racism. Like the racism that this country was founded on, where you can't escape conversations about that, whether it's, in the 1600s, the 1800s, or today, or in that time in the 70s, right? Like, so racism was the conversation. And then whether it was genocide, whether it was enslavement, whether it was Black codes, whether it's the fugitive slave law, whether it's the Supreme Court, all of that was grounded in, okay, this is what people did to ensure that free white men you know, they said they didn't want a monarchy. They didn't want one king. They wanted a bunch of kings, as long as they were free white men. And, you know, that's the difference. And that's how we were taught the difference between, you know, Britain or Europe and Americas. It's that they didn't want a single king, but they wanted a bunch of whoever was the wealthiest, whether it was a plantation owner, whether it was a shipbuilder, whether it was a businessman on the stock exchange. Those were the kings, right? And if you can't see that, and that still happens, right? Because if you can't see that, if you don't teach your children that, then you start to think like, oh, this is really just a democracy, and justice will prevail. You know, trust the system. Where we were raised to like, that same system is why we're in the conditions we are in today. So don't trust it. And then the other part is, if people just talk about enslavement and not talk about, you know, the humanity, and, you know, you hear people now trying to stop saying, oh, we took slaves from Africa. No, you took doctors and teachers and educators and farmers, and so you took people and enslaved them because of your racism. And then what it was about their humanity, what cultures did they bring, what new cultures did they establish, what was the resistance like, right? Because if a lot of people just talking about enslavement, they just, you know, like the story about the happy slaves in George Washington. They don't talk about Ona Judge, who escaped from bondage of George Washington in Philadelphia, where it was supposedly illegal to own slaves, but he had him anyway. Remember in Goodfellas when he was like, they were talking about owing money to the mob. He's like, oh, this happened. F you, pay me. Well, this happened. I can't pay you. F you, pay me. That's how, like, F you. I'm white. You know, I don't care what the law is. I'm gonna keep that. So I think the full humanity gets lost when you just talk about slavery in many of these schools and in these books and in these textbooks and so on and so forth.
I mean, it seems like to me there's two questions, like one, teaching it wrong, or two, teaching it as like the primary lesson about blacks in America. Like both of those things seem to be making people more ignorant than they're worth. And
it's really the same thing, right? It's teaching it wrong. If you start with that, you're teaching it wrong. Yeah. And if you just have erroneous, like, you know, oh, happy slaves and there was no resistance and they were happy to, you know, bake cakes and all kind of nonsense like that, then, you know,
it feels in a lot of ways like there was a really bad thing that happened to these people. They fought for their freedom, and a really nice white guy came and wrote this thing, and they were released, and then that started their history in America, and that was it. That's kind of like the story of slavery. It's missing a lot of context.
Yeah,
a lot of layers, right? And this is why, you know, I asked the question, what should we teach our kids about slavery? Because number one, we have all these rash of stories coming out of classrooms where parents are upset about what their kids have learned, right? They have these assignments, they come home, they look at them and like, oh, hell no, you know, my kid's not learning that. But nobody really ever answers, for educators even, answers the question of, okay, what would be the right way to teach this? I'm looking at this report from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I will put the link into the comments for everybody. Into the chat for everybody. But it says that only 8% of high school seniors surveyed can identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 68% don't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end slavery. 68%. Wow, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot. I mean, because a lot of people probably think, oh, Abraham Lincoln is the one that did it. You know,
they probably think he himself actually came in wearing with guns or something.
Yeah, they should read. And you always talk about primary sources, right? They should read his. They should read his speeches. You know, about what he would do to save the Union. He'd keep you all enslaved if he could save the Union that way.
Do you think if they stopped teaching slavery that it would be a problem? If they just stopped teaching about it, period?
Yeah.
You think that would be a problem?
Yeah, because I think that feeds into the American exceptionalism or whatever, right? Like that this country was just built out of just ingenuity and hard work of white folks, you know, like that, you know, and the European immigrants who just crossed the prairie and just did all this, you know, finding of gold and you know, without talking about like, no, you ravaged and raped and pillaged and took gold. You didn't find gold, you extracted it from. You didn't, become this, when you hear it described like became the mightiest empire or force or industrialized, all of that kind of stuff. Who was that on the backs of? So if you erase that important foundational piece, then yeah, it's problematic. You get a lot of white folks now is like, well, only a few people actually own slaves. I don't want to hear about who owned. I want to talk about who benefited from enslavement of millions of people. It wasn't just the person whose name was on the deed of stolen land. It was on every single aspect of American industry and economics.
It feels like that would be a better lesson to teach about the enslavement of Africans in America than almost any other. It would be good to separate slavery from Black or African history. It would be good for people in schools and in classrooms to teach people that African and African American history is its own separate animal. So when we talk about slavery, that's an American problem. That's an American thing. And that's a white lesson. That's about white people. African and African American history is about Black people. Slavery history is about white people. And the question that you just put on the table to me seems to be like the central one. If you teach kids who benefited from this, let's not just talk about how bad it was. Let's not just talk about like what happened, the actual events and everything. Let's talk about the engine that it created and who benefited from it. And let's not just stop in the slavery years. Let's talk about who benefited from the material that was developed during that time, after that time, right? So you have lots of people who say, well, I wasn't even here for slavery. I'm Irish. My fighting Irish people came after, after slavery was done. And I always like to remind people who say something like that, but your people came to your people came from shithole countries to a fully formed economy that was formed on our back. Like they got here, they didn't buy in. They didn't pay the cost to buy into this casino. We were already here. We generated the money for the casino that your parents came. So your immigrant parents came here and got on third base right away, basically. No, they worked hard. Yeah, we all worked hard. Everybody worked hard. Matter of fact, some of us worked so hard that we died, but y'all came over here and worked hard and got right to the front of the line because you were benefiting from, to your point, you were benefiting from the capital that had been developed in a period of time before you got here. Right. Exactly. And when we talk about reparations, people don't want to talk about reparations because it happened so long ago and blah, 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 and all this. Those Irish people who came here, those Italians that came here, everybody else who came here and benefited from a fully formed country with a fully formed economy that was booming, who came from shithole countries to enjoy that because they couldn't rub two potatoes together and get a full meal. Well, those are some of the same people that are in Congress today talking about how Black people need to get over it. Right. But the capital, we don't trace the money. We don't follow the money. Maybe that's the better lesson and context for slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think, some of these history courses should just be changed and really called, racism in America, in America's 1400 to 1500, like that kind of thing. There's 1600, 1700. That should be a central part of it, because then you can see the evolution and the development of race theory around, whiteness, for example, tracing the history of whiteness and establishing and being able to get to the front of the line where you don't own land, but hey, I can sure be a paddle roller, or I can sure be an overseer, or I can sure be, the town sheriff and warden, right? You start seeing this and othering one group of people and creating the laws of, hey, if you catch them, do whatever you want to do them, cut their toes, kill them. It doesn't matter because they symbolize resistance, right? Like all of that has to be, talked about in the context of who created these laws, who are supporting these laws, who's burning people at the stake for saying, I want liberty, I want death, and who's lionized, as you said, as you talked about before, for saying, give me liberty or give me death, right? And so all of that, I think, really talks about the racism and the greed. And you combine those two and you get genocide, mass enslavement, mass incarceration, and so on and so forth, what that still plagues this country. Like you can't you can't talk about what's happening today without talking about the originality of it. The original, as Marian Wright Edelman says, America's original birth defect is its racism.
Is it racism? Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that you can teach slavery appropriately in classrooms that are black and white versus all white or all black classrooms? Do you think that there's a difference in the way that it has to be taught depending on who's in your classroom?
I think your depths of understanding and knowledge needs to be, thorough, regardless of who's teaching it. I think so many white people are, consumed with, anger or frustration or fear or guilt or whatever, or indifference, like what they say, the opposite of love is not hate, is indifference. So all of that and maybe a combination of all of it. And so I think that's really important. I think black educators in a room full of white students may, sometimes they experience, and I've heard people talk specifically about this, but they have talking about things about race, class, and privilege. And when they're in these groups and they feel like, hey, you know what? Some of these white parents may give backlash if I speak my truth or really just share true history, right? And so I do think the nuance. And here in Philadelphia, most of the students have to take African American studies before they graduate high school. Not all of them, but most of them. And plenty of students, as well as black and brown teachers, will say there are so many white people teaching the Black History course that are destroying it. Dana King talked about this, right, when she was on your show several, maybe a month or so ago. She talked about this, how sometimes the curriculum, even when it's the best written curriculum, sometimes get destroyed because at the end of the day, it's the mindset of the leader of the classroom that matters most.
I see that Michelle Johnson says that people should read the slave narratives, primary sources, which we talk about a lot in primary documents, which I just think is a good way to understand all of history, not just
one of the best ways.
Slavery or whatever.
Yep.
One of the best ways. So, so go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, no, I was going to say, with this primary document, I think it's so important. And even growing up, I would see, I would go to black institutions and see a picture of Lincoln. And, mind you, I'm in the elementary school and like, why is he up there next to Dr. King?
Yeah.
And I would question this, because as a 6 and 7 year old, and again, my mother would always say, we're going to choose our heroes. We're not going to let other people choose them for us, whether through textbook, through media, through speech, or whatever. Right. This idea, if you read his early speeches, you wouldn't think he was, John Brown, but the way he's described sometimes like he's John Brown and he fought the forces of pro-slavery movement. Read when states were talking about, remember this idea of Fort Sumter, the attack on that and that being the divide of the nation. Those grumblings have been happening for years about separating and forming two countries, right? And so this whole idea of this is about state right. Yeah, it was your state's right to own other human beings. That was the state right, but they want to shorten and just say, oh, this war is about states right. No, finish the sentence. It was about your state's right, ability and freedom to enslave other human beings. That's what the state right. That was the only straight. We talked about this yesterday. This is the one thing that unites despite the Civil War and the rhetoric now. And Dr. Fuller said it's never been a united country. And the only thing that they would be united in is in racism. These are the United States of racism, if anything. So, understanding the primary documents is an integral part of that. So you don't get this changing of the narrative later.
So for people watching, we are having a little bit of technical difficulties. Sharif, you're going in and out a little bit. I think it's the internet situation. So
yeah.
There you go.
Zoom,
went out again.
Oh man,
coming in and out, getting a little bit of the robot voice. Are you back? You there?
I hope so.
It's still kind of in and out a little bit. But Michelle Johnson says Lincoln was straight up racist. And I think it's interesting that a point like that. Sharif, you're coming in and out, man. um, um, Michelle, a point like that actually goes back to my question about whether or not we should be teaching different kids the same thing. Um, because like you say something like that, Lincoln was straight up racist, and now all of a sudden we're going to have a fight in society about who and how we should teach about Lincoln and about others. Sharif, you're back. Toya says you sound fine, so maybe it's just me that's hearing it come in and out. You back there?
Yeah, well, we'll
right.
see. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. So I was just talking about Michelle. Her point that Lincoln was racist is a good example of a claim that you could make that depending on where you are in the country and what school you're in, that's going to be taught differently.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to disagree, which comes back to my main point all the time. We're not all meant to go to school together. We're not all meant to be in the same classrooms. And the way that you teach this slavery and whatnot is going to be different depending on, like, if you live in a red county and you're going to an elementary school in a red county, there's no way that they're going to teach that Lincoln was racist. Right.
Yeah. I mean, listen, in some blue counties, they're not going to teach that.
Well, that's true.
That's true. You ain't got to go far. You ain't got to go far. You know, what Malcolm say, you know, everybody talking about like, oh, Mississippi, they doing it. Everybody feeling good. Like we better than Mississippi. Malcolm said New York is Mississippi, as far as I'm concerned. Right. It's all the same. Mm-hmm. It's all the same stuff. You know,
well,
but
Mott here says we should teach the truth. And this is kind of striking at my point, like whose truth? Mm-hmm. Like if me, you, and Mott sat down and wrote the curriculum, it would be a different curriculum than the people who are writing it right now.
Exactly. I mean, I think then it goes back to, and you say this all the time, and I'm so glad Michelle Johnson brought this up, primary sources. Like that's about as close to the truth as you're going to get. And so when you talk about people like, you know, so you pose these questions for students to grapple with, no matter what grade they're in. Like, is this fair? And just talk about, you know, one group owning another group. Is that fair? One group being not only unpaid, but could be separated as a family, right? And so you can make it more sophisticated as students get older. And then you can look at, oh, here's what Lincoln said. And what was the tactic? You know, Lincoln's losing the war. What are ways that he could start winning the war, right? And then you can start seeing like, oh, well, you know what? He started doing this. Oh, the emancipation. That was everybody freed, or was a group of folks freed? Was it just the bad, you know, folks who were, you know, battling him? But suppose they owned slaves and they didn't. They said, we're not going to fight against you, Lincoln. Can we keep our slaves? Have students look and see what that answer was, you know? So I think all of those can help inform, and that one is the truth. Two, the teacher can kind of let students kind of see this is what was happening, and then they can compare. Hey, here's what, you know, racist white folks are saying now about this flag. Here's what they said about it then. You compare the two and tell me who's lying. You know. So,
do you think that many of our kids are tired of hearing about this stuff?
You know what? I think kids who are one, I don't think most kids have heard the real stuff. You know, I think some kids, particularly depending on how they're actually being taught, are taught that you shouldn't want to hear this. And so, but then that's also part of, you know, some kids are tired of hearing about math. I would imagine. It doesn't mean that math is yanked out of the curriculum. It's like, hey, how are you as a teacher delivering the math? Right? How are we delivering?
Well, I mean, okay, let me challenge that point just a little bit, though. You still have to need, no matter what, today, tomorrow, yesterday, you still need to know how to count. You need to know how to count money, how to count your change, how to count the 15% off something at Target, whatever. You need to do that. I don't know that every child is going to see the utility of hearing about slavery again when they're in a very postmodern, fast-paced, gamified, social media-fied world where things are moving at a fast pace. They're listening to a lot of contemporary art and music or whatnot, and then they sit down in a classroom. Somebody wants to talk to them about 150 years ago.
My response to that would be, yeah, they should. But again, it's not just about slavery. It's about the formation of this country. It's about the racism that existed then and now. If they use a text like slavery by any other name, I think that's the name of it, right? Like
Slavery by another name.
By another name, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
That's today. Even if some of the stories are from years ago, from 1900 or 1880. It's today too, right? And so if they're talking about they want to be what problem do you want to solve? Well, I want to be defend people in the courtroom. I want to be a lawyer or a judge. You're not going to be an effective one. You're not going to be this balanced, guy holding up the scales of justice equally if you don't understand the foundations that these laws were created upon. If you don't get that, it's not going to work for you, right? And so whatever it is, it's still up to the teacher and those who prepare teachers to get it right. And that's where so often it's dropped. If new teachers are saying we're not prepared to teach people, period, then you already know they're not prepared to teach the complexities of. And sometimes it's not so complex; it's pretty simple. But racism, historic racism in America, and the impact of it today.
Do you think, though, going back to an earlier point, that they should put it in the context of slavery is specifically American history and African and Black history is specifically its own thing, and we will do both. We will do both, but we're not going to have a Black kid sitting in a classroom thinking slavery is his or her history and having a white kid think, oh, that's that bad thing we did to Black people a long time ago, but it's over with, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, it should be I think is a couple ways to look at it. One way to look at it is it's American history. This is how America was founded. This is how America reaped the benefits. This is how America's 200 years old, 250, whatever the year is, right? 200 X amount of years, right? For them to have leapfrogged over civilizations that are thousands of years old, there's something that happened. It wasn't just this, oh, Americans are just smarter than everybody else, you can't escape it, right? And so I think what happens is with slavery, it only talks about the Black experience, and even then, it's not really talked about, right? It doesn't talk about like their resistance, their culture, their moral superiority, even during bondage. Like none of that kind of stuff is talked about. It's only talked about like, oh yeah, own slaves, da, da, da. All right, let's move. And Lincoln is a hero, Civil War, blah blah blah, and move on. If you talk about like the development of race, if you talk about the economic system that was established, right? If you talk about Lloyd's of London, you went to Birmingham. We took students to Birmingham from Freedom Schools down to Montgomery to see the Equity and Justice Initiative, EJI, Brian Anderson's work. And when one of the places we visited were places that exist today and acknowledge that all of their money came from enslaving Black people. Right? Like that's an important history for people to be aware of. Every once in a while you hear of a bank or university like Georgetown or somewhere else say, yes, we, but it's far and few between, right? That's part of the truth that Maat was talking about. Acknowledging what's happening today and how it started. What's the seed? The seed is a big fat seed of racism that sprouted trees all over this country that are the fruits of racism. And like we can't escape that. So we can't escape that from enslavement, and we can't escape the genocide of Native Americans, right? Like that's another topic that people don't want to talk about, right? Because how was it taught? A lot of folks were taught through the media that the cowboys were the good guys, at least how they're depicted, right? Like it's not cowboys. Oh, I'm taking cattle from one place to another. No, it's like, oh, we're going to go kill the Indians, right? When Public Enemy say F him and John Wayne, there are reasons for that. They're resisting against the lessons that are being taught about who the heroes are, who established this country, and what they found, whether it was gold, whether it was land, or whether it was slaves. You ain't find none of this.
Well, they found it. Like, let me come over to your house and find some things.
Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, for me, there'd be like more than one way that you can put slavery into context and teach it. But there are two clear ways to me that make a difference to what I want my kids taught today. And you and I, we go back and forth constantly about the 1619 Project. And you've got one of the more moderate pushbacks on me about the 1619 Project. But my problem with the 1619 Project is that if you were going to teach America about this situation, this racial situation, it's the wrong frame for me. 1619 to me feels a lot like trauma porn, and not for us, not for our audience. And it feels like guilt-inducing trauma porn meant to make some other group of people feel like they are somehow on the hook for something versus achievement literature. I don't want my Black kids being taught. I don't want them being taught that they are losers in a game and that they're forever victims when we have way too many stories. How many slave uprisings were there? And when did they ever stop? They never did. When did Black people stop fighting for their freedom? They never did. They're still happening today. They never stopped fighting for their freedom. They never stopped winning in many cases. They never stopped scaring the shit out of white people in so many cases. There was so much power in them. They had everything from slight resistance to outright insurrection over and over and over and over again. So if I'm going to tell a story that I think empowers the child today, I'm going to tell them not the trauma porn story. You were a loser. They treated you so bad. They beat you up. They, cut you down. They did all this stuff, blah, blah, blah. And then you got freed and then they lynched you for a bunch of years and then blah, 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 blah. Without telling it, if you are alive today and you are watching this right now and you are a Black person in the United States, you are a survivor, but you're also a winner, right? Because on the ships over here, there were a whole bunch of people that just jumped ship and died in the ocean rather than be taken alive, right? That's a good number of people. Once they got here, there were a bunch of people who died because they were either killed or worked to death or maimed to death or whatever because of the wage system. And then there was a group of people that survived that and came through that. And after that, there were still groups of people that got lynched and early deaths, killed themselves because of post-traumatic slave syndrome, all of that. And then there was a group that even through that came. If you are watching this today, you are part of the group that came through. And that to me is the story. That's the real story, is that no matter what they throw at you, you will survive. You can make it. It's in you. They haven't decimated you completely. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why is it that they haven't actually been able to completely wipe you out? And it's because there's something in you that runs in your race that keeps you alive today. That to me is a better story than the loser victim. You never won anything. It was just done to you. You're a passive actor in the story. Like there's so many times where the stories are being told in ways in which we were just a passive actor amongst all the white people who were doing the big stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like we were just, it's almost like faceless and nameless, whatever people. And you're like a child in this story of white adults who are doing things everywhere or whatnot. Mm-hmm. I want my kids learning that. Yeah. That doesn't seem like the smart way to teach it.
No, I mean, I love that you brought this out. I think it goes back to, what we started off with, this idea of freedom and resistance. And I think that's what Nthamu Musasa was grounded in, that we, were taught at a very young age that, the blood that runs through you, this God created blood is something that, cherish, honor, and know that people will want to, do all types of things against you. Evil things against you because of the color of your skin, and you are not to succumb. You are to continue this, this fight. And so I think this, I think how you described it, like, and go beyond the heroes of, and I love them dearly, but Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and William Still, and here are all the white people that did it. We used to study, Toussaint in the Haitian Revolution, and why did that make America so angry and afraid, and why did France punish Haiti? That continues today, right? How do we look at places like where Nat Turner, they say that Nat Turner, after Nat Turner's rebellion, that Virginia almost voted to end slavery, and so as a kid, we're just like, all he had to do is get to a couple more plantations, kill a couple more white folks.
For many people, yeah.
Yeah, Virginia was a key place. Virginia, South Carolina, right? Like this was, part of the expansion southward and westward, right? Like, man, all he had to do, he was that close to ending it as a single person saying, like, this has to end, right? Like that's to me, that's part of the story that people don't even talk about Nat Turner, but to understand the ripple effect. Not on one, this is why my mom says don't say white supremacy. Talk about white savagery that's grounded in racism, right? Like what happened when Nat Turner said, "I demand, give me liberty or give me death." What did they do to not only to the people that were with him, but folks who hadn't even heard of him, right? But then also, what was the reaction? How did some people say, "Oh, we got to stop this"? If they read Thomas Jefferson and say where he says, like, what we're doing is evil, and God will hold us accountable for it. But you know what? I'm so greedy, I'm gonna do it anyway, right? Like, so those are all the parts of it that we have to share. But ultimately, yeah, I think that resistance, I think the brilliance, I mean, just the brilliance, you are like surrounded, locked down and everything, but the brilliance of not only surviving, but passing the torch of resistance and freedom and hope is like, it's absolutely, I can't think of anything but just a gift of God, for folks people talk about like 5 years of being captured in wars, like a la John McCain and like how I'm like, imagine that times an exponential number of years, right? Like that, like that's the hero. Like all these statues, like those should really be the statues of America, like that's what it is, because it's not just the labor, but it's also, what Black people have taught. Not only did they have the moral superiority at that time, they've continued to have it. They've continued to say, no, this is what justice actually looks like. This is what equal protection under the law actually looks like. We have to keep fighting for it in legislation, but we actually have a vision for what it is. Not the wealth owning white guy. Like he never has. He had a different vision for America. And it's still, that legacy continues.
Yeah, I think about, like, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the better context to teach this in. And I think to make it useful for today, if you wanted to teach it in a context where it didn't just teach you about the past, but you were also making it useful for today, I'd love the history to be told, slavery to be taught as a way of Black brilliance and ingenuity. When you start thinking about things like what was the technology used that Sojourner Truth and Nat Turner and others developed under extreme duress to get messages out to people, to organize things, to get people to arrive at a place at a certain time, to develop networks, to develop paths to freedom. If it became a story about the ingenuity of a people to engineer freedom rather than a way in which to teach people how to be better slaves or how to be the victim, that would be two different lenses that I would put on the story. I prefer the first one rather than the second one. It feels like it's being taught right now, not as a way to teach you about how you get your freedom. It's taught in a way to teach you how to be abused and how to keep whining about it over long periods of time. Right. And I don't mean that in some, jacked up conservative way about whining about it. I just mean you're missing the story. The story, what you just said about Nat Turner getting very close to making them change the law, like one person organized a rebellion that needs to be examined. That needs to be the story. It doesn't need the story. That is not a victim story, right? Nat Turner's, and he's not the only story like that. And I think we tell heroic stories. We tell like the Frederick Douglass, he's born into slavery and he eventually became what Charles Cole, Dr. Cole tells us all the time, the most photographed man of the 17th century, 18th century, whatever. We tell some of those stories, but I do think it's the frame. Those are random stories. I think we need to tell it in the frame of Black ingenuity towards freedom, Black fight for their freedom. I'm looking at, as we were talking, I was trying to think of who it was I was thinking of. I looked up Robert Smalls, and Robert Smalls was born into slavery, right?
Why ain't he a movie?
Why is that not a movie? I mean, he's born into slavery in the South. He freed himself, his crew, and his family, which is a story we don't tell enough, is how many how many people bought their own freedom and then went back and bought their family's freedom, right? And how did they do that? They had to do that through economics, because they had to learn how to sell some things and buy some things and whatever. And they figured it out at a time where literacy was very low and blah, blah, blah. And they still did it. I'm always amazed when I hear these stories of how did you put together $1,000 in a time where a nickel could have paid you for like a month's worth of work? How did you get $1,000 to go back and buy the freedom for your wife and for your kids and all of that? That to me is the story, not, oh, you were put into this situation, you could do nothing about it. No. No matter what they threw at you, you came back and got your wife and your kids, and you figured out how to make the money work, how to make the work work, all of that. Anyway, so this dude, eventually commandeers a Confederate transport ship, right? Like how? like why is this not the main story here, right? Not only does he do that, and he sails it into Confederate controlled waters to the harbor of the U.S. Blockade that surrounded it. He then piloted the ship to Union controlled enclave in Beaufort, right? How, Robert Smalls? Tell me, many years before Biggie Smalls, how did you do this? What made you think to do this? But here's my favorite part. So then he comes back, and after the American Civil War, he becomes a politician. He becomes elected as a Republican to the South Carolina state legislature, and he's the one who authors during Reconstruction, and he authors the legislation that would make South Carolina the first state in the Union to have free and compulsory public schools, right? Mm-hmm. So you have a dude born in slavery, 1839, who does all this kind of like crazy stuff, like commandeering a ship and driving it through.
Man, like what?
Confederate waters and all that to safe harbor. That to me, right, just in one story, that to me is the frame in which we could teach slavery, is that we could teach it through the lens of brilliance and through excellence and through beating insurmountable odds. And you have to ask why. Like, number one, why was he able to do this? How was he able to do this? What made him think he could do all of that? How was he successful? He didn't die in any of that. He came back and was a politician. Anyways,
that's the type of politicians we need, right? Like, but that story, right? And just countless other stories like that. Like, I think that's part of like what education is supposed to be about. One, you said like, how was he able to do it? He wasn't distracted, man. Freedom and education, like those are the two pieces that he saw. And I think that's what they all saw. Like, I'm also just like you, fascinated when they would say like, oh, they bought themselves and their family. Like, it's just mind boggling. And I think about that scene in Roots often where, I think Chicken George was arguing with Kizzy about money that they had buried. Like this is like that, like all of that, like what happened. You've spoken a lot about the spending power of today. Suppose we had the focus of freedom, true liberation, and education with this kind of spending power. Like what would that mean? And then also just like law. So I still think it goes through. At Shoemaker, we used to talk to the teachers, and they would about this idea of like, no matter what subject you teach, you can tie it into how it supported racism or how it supports justice. If you're teaching economics, you can do that. Mm-hmm. If you're teaching mathematics, you can do that. No matter where it is, you can still do that. And so that's one of the things that we wanted everybody to really kind of endure. One, it pushed them to go learn and study beyond what they were taught in their teacher prep programs, because this was not a topic in many of these teacher prep programs. Mm-hmm. And two, it helps them reframe, right, that this education is for a purpose. And so no matter what students are learning and what they aspire to accomplish later, they have these groundings in this understanding. They're able to connect the dots between all of these things, right? And so I think you sharing that story about, another one of these heroes, like this is why it's important. This is why education is so important. How many people have never heard of him, right? Mm-hmm. Never heard of him. Never heard of these concepts, these ideas. They hear about Harriet Tubman, for example, who's, freed slaves, they haven't heard about her work in the war, you know, as one of the first women to actually encounter, not a nurse, not just a nurse, I should say, but actually, you know, doing military operations, right? Like that kind of, you know, I think understanding, and still just a framework. Like when you look at laws, why laws are passed even today, and make the connection. Why were laws passed where Black people couldn't hold a pencil or a paper? Why they couldn't own land or cattle, right? Why they couldn't go anywhere without written white man's permission, right? Like all of these things over and over again. These were laws that kept being passed all the way to Plessy versus Ferguson, right? And then I mean, it's endless, right? But you have to make a decision and say, like, hey, you know what? I'm teaching. This is a course about X, but when I'm really teaching about American imperialism or American institutions and where they really, how they skyrocketed, you know, all of these things. How does racism, you know, pervade all of the subject matter that we're teaching? We can choose to do it, or we can choose to ignore it at the end of the day. And most people are choosing to ignore it.
So I had said earlier that I was going to put the study from the Southern Poverty Law Center into the comments for people to read, and it talks a lot about how history is being taught, and it has some data on what teachers feel about how prepared they were, how much students actually know about it, and the frame that we're using to teach slavery. And basically what it's saying in the end, it's saying that it's insufficient the way that it is, that there are insufficient standards about how you teach. There's insufficient content in the text and the curriculum that is being taught. Teachers don't feel very prepared. They report that they feel okay, like 50-something% feel like they feel okay teaching it, but they don't feel like they have the tools necessary to teach it.
And Lord knows what okay means.
Yeah, right. Like okay is just okay. And it also basically says that, like, because of all those things that I just put together, that the historic knowledge that kids have, that students have, that our young people have and are getting is really facile, really insufficient and facile. I want to wrap on I'll say my last piece. I'll let you say last piece. I'm going to put this in the comments here. But my quick and dirty about this is, I'm a parent, so I'm not an educator. You're an educator, so it'd be interesting to hear your wrap on what the educator part is. For educators listening to this, I'm sure the question is around, how can I be better? How can I be different? How can I not do this the wrong way? How can I do this the right way? Because I'm sure that's what teachers want to know. They don't want to just hear, you know, that it's not working. They want to know, like, okay, if I am going to have Black kids, I don't want to be one of these people that show up on the news or on social media somewhere with somebody putting one of my assignments on there saying that I, you know, did something. So I'll let you address that part. But from a parent perspective, and I'm one parent talking, I'm sure we're all over the map, depending on our age, our class, our goals for our kids or whatever. So I'm speaking for myself, but everybody else can chime in for themselves. I don't want my kids I don't want to implant an operating system into their hardware that is a permanent victim loop that teaches them not about their possibilities and potential, but teaches them about their lack of possibilities and potential. So when I think about this frame, I almost would prefer that if you're going to teach slavery badly, that you don't teach it, for one, to my kids. You can teach it badly to other people's children, but I prefer that if you're going to be as empty of a vessel as this report says that the system is when it comes to teaching this, that you don't do more damage through miseducation of my kids and giving them the wrong perception of their own history and themselves and how they place themselves within the context of history, than just not doing it at all, first of all. So that's the first thing I'll say. If you do have to do it, I don't care how you teach it to white kids or to other people, but if you're going to teach it to the ancestors or to the descendants of the people who were enslaved, I think you have an obligation to teach it through an empowerment series, a way in which that doesn't leave the student less well off, actually leaves them more encouraged about life and about how we got here. And for me, the way to do that is teach it through a brilliance, genius, empowerment frame of not what happened to Black people, because that puts Black people in a passive role, but what Black people did to overcome every circumstance that was thrown at them. And there is a story and a place in history that can prove every single point that I just made, that it was a nonstop resistance of different sorts. You can tell just a straight up resistance story and it would all be true. It would 100% be true, and it would all be successful. This idea that someone signed a document that emancipated everybody and there was no context that came before that, it involved Black people in constant resistance, to me is abusive to kids, to teach kids that today. And it doesn't help them, doesn't empower them in any way, shape, or form. Again, that's my final word. I'm just one parent. I actually want to prepare my kids to be leaders and to not feel like life is something that happens to them passively. Because of that, I don't want you at school teaching them badly, that theirs isn't a tradition of achievement and success and resistance and overcoming. That's my final word. So what say you, educator, to educators, even to me as a parent, and then to educators? What's your final wrap on it?
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of important points. What I would say is that, one, it's a challenging topic to talk about, and it must be had. It gives me no pleasure to remember and think about, and we have to. If I do get pleasure, it's about, as you said, the resistance, the creativity, the humanity. I think it's important for students to also see, and my own children as well as my students, it's important to see the lengths that the depraved mind will go to destroy another group or to exploit them, like the lengths that people will go for that. And when I think about, and I always have to just reconnect it to like how I recall being raised, right? Like, so when Roots came out, that was something we watched every night as a family. I must have been 7 or 8 years old, right? That came out, 77, 78, somewhere around there. So I'm either a 6 or 7 year old, same age as one of my daughters. And and it wasn't shocking to me because I had already spoken about it. This was just like in film, but these are things that we already read about, spoken about, the resistance, the push, to demand to be recognized as a human being. Like we had already seen it. And when I think about like how hard it must be for a child, I'm just like, I don't recall I'm sure it's like traumatic for some children to exactly as you said, like to just see the oppression. And when it's not balanced, and I think that's where my family and my teachers did a great job, is toward the oppression, because they're like, this is the lengths that people went to try to, take away something that was God given. And here are the lengths that you went through, your family, your ancestors went through to resist that. And so it's you're going to, children are going to be angry. So being able to address it and talk about it, and with whoever the child is, whether it's Black children or white children and everybody else, like, here's the reality of what happened. Here's how America was envisioned and established. And guess what? Let's look for evidence where that vision is alive today. Where's the evidence that the resistance of that Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and Tucson and the Stono Rebellion, like just countless. How does that continue to evolve, and how does that legacy? So I think that balance, that full story, that's it. And I show my students this YouTube clip. I don't forget the sister's name, but they're talking about the dangers of the single story. And right now it is dominated in textbooks, in teacher prep programs, in classrooms. A single, uncomplex, simple story, which is easy. If they're going to choose a single story, it ain't going to be ours, right? So that then again speaks to who are the teachers, who's creating schools, who's out here to say like this is connected to liberation. So the idea of like, imagine if teacher prep program said, Our job is to help the next generation of educators liberate education. How would they then approach subjects like American history, world history, all of that? But if it's not, if it's devoid of that banner, that North Star, then it's very easy to tell a simplistic story of that erases the amazing brilliance of Black people who were enslaved. So who's teaching all of this is just as important.
I think that's amazing. And as always, you are profound, brother. Speechless. You do the education part. I do the parental bomb throwing.
And that's listen, throw them.
Well, it's all together. It's like all one thing, isn't it? It's one revolution. You put them all together.
Exactly.
Well, as always, this has been another Freedom Friday. Appreciate everyone who comes and gives us your time for an hour. It's one of my favorite days of the week because Sharif and I get to talk about something that actually matters to me. And hopefully it matters to you, and we can keep the conversations going every week. At the end of this week, I actually meant to do this earlier, but I do have something that I want to share as an announcement. And this is not something I would typically do, but I want to do it today because it matters to me. So this is a group. If you can go on to Facebook and you can look for this group, Mothers Against Senseless Killings in Chicago, you'll find that they have a thing that's coming up tomorrow that that is, I don't know how it happened, but it's a event, a back to school fair that they're having. And all their supplies got stolen. And it's tomorrow, tomorrow at 12 p.m. noon. So if you can go and find them, they have an Amazon wish list where you can help, you can provide things, you can even send them some money or whatnot. Here's a picture of them coming in to find all their stuff, rummage through. So there's two things I learned about this. Number one is there's a lot of jackasses in the world and evil people, and God will find those who did this, but then there's also a lot of good and giving people. So if you are one of those folks, again, look for Mothers Against Senseless Killing on Facebook. You'll find, when you get there, you'll find their post about what happened. But more importantly, you'll find this post that has an Amazon link to where you can help them get things like Kindles they need. And then some basic supplies that they're going to give out tomorrow. I think it's going to work out. I think lots of people are already giving in, already there. So please, please, please go and be a good person. Do your thing, man. Give in. We're richer people than we think. So give something to these folks tomorrow that are doing a good thing.
Yeah.
And with that, I felt like that was about to be the church announcements, and systematize gonna have some but I gotta have an announcement of some sorts like this when we have so many good people watching, right? It's important to give back and help. So all right, everybody, have a blessed weekend. We'll see you guys next week on next Freedom Friday, and we have a good show planned for you for then. So please come back. Sharif, thank you as always, brother.